Okay, so as sort of a thanks. So as an introduction, when I originally gave a version of this idea, I called it Psak, Politics, and the Art of Persuasion. Right, and again, the central thesis, as I mentioned, is that I don't think of Psak as just the formulation of a theoretical halachic position. Right, I really do think of it as politics. And again, I mean that in the high sense of the word. Right, I mean, what is politics? Right, if I ask you, what is politics? Right, not cynical. Like, what is politics?
The art of creating rules for society.
Right, I mean, it's the art of creating society. That's exactly what it is, right? Politics, right, when people say you play politics, right, I mean, they say that cynically. But what they mean, right, when they say, right, when they say in, like, the election cycle that someone has a history of getting legislation passed bipartisan, right? Why is that important? Right? Why is it important to say that?
Because it means they're willing to work with people.
And that they're able to, right? Meaning, when you hear this sometimes in political debates, right? They'll say, to put names to it, right? I'm not staking out my own political positions, but, right? When people said, Bernie is an ideologue, right? But he will never get anything done because he won't, right? Because he won't budge, right? What are people saying? They're saying, look, we may agree with him, we may not agree with him. But being a politician isn't just about having a position that we agree with, because who cares if you have a position that we agree with if you're not going to manage to do anything about it? So when people say, look, we have to be realistic, right? We have to be able to work with the other side, right? They're playing politics. It's not a negative thing. What they're saying is it's not enough to have the right views. Right? Politics is about creating a better society. Right? It's the art of creating a society. And part of that is practical. And Psak is, in that sense, political. Because your goal, right, if you write a theoretical book, right, so you're staking out your own position. But when someone asks you a shaila, when someone asks you a question, you respond. You're not just giving a theoretical position. You are trying, ideally, to make sure that the position you believe is implemented into the real world. Right? And that's at a small level if a single person asks you a question. But that's at a much bigger level if, you are the posek for a community. And again, I should point this out, because if it's not clear, right, and if it wasn't clear last year, right, I should just say it explicitly. When I say I want to do this in experiment because I want you to imagine getting into the role of a posek, I mean that, right? I don't mean this theoretically. That is something I believe is a perfectly legitimate option if you want to pursue that, right? You can be in a position of being a posek. You can, right? There's no reason you can't, right? I want you to get into this headspace because you might be there, right? And even if you're not a posek for other people, right? I think if you're an educated person, you should be capable of making certain decisions for yourself. Right? You should, right? Everyone should know their own limits, right? You can't make, I would not put myself in the situation of making life and death decisions, right? Even though I will poskin on, let's say mid-level questions for myself or for other people, right? But I won't poskin life and death shilas. But I think any educated person has the right to make certain decisions by themselves. I don't think you need to go to a post. You can say that this is, iconoclastic, whatever. Right? I think really, right, if you're educated enough to learn, I think you can make a decision yourself. This is something I really want you to understand. You can do, right? And I'm specifically not going to pick a question that is, I think, is the type of thing that only the Gadol Hador can paskin, right? Right? I don't think, because that's not where I think any of us are in terms of our capabilities of Psak. Okay. But like I said, I think of Psak in that sense as politics. And in Aristotle's work on politics, one of the main things he talks about is that a politician needs to be good at the art of rhetoric. Right? Because again, if politics is about getting things done. It's not just important to mean the right thing. You have to say the right thing in the right way, or it won't happen. Right? It just won't happen. Right? And as look, we all know this. Whether or not you support the current president, right? It's
Who shall remain nameless?
what?
Who shall
The
remain
one who shall
nameless?
not be named.
He definitely doesn't do himself favors with people who are inclined to not like him by the fact that he is,
Rambunctious.
yes, that he's not careful in the way he says things, right? On the other hand, it helps him with a certain audience, right? Meaning, okay, so I gave you just a quote from Aristotle because I think it is helpful to think about this, and he notes, right, he says as follows: of the modes of persuasion furnished by the spoken word, there are three kinds. The first kind depends on the personal character of the speaker. Okay? The second, on putting the audience into a certain frame of mind. The third, on the proof or apparent proof provided by the words of the speech itself. And now I think Aristotle's insight is very important for Psak, because I think that these three factors are very much important as to outlining how good of a posek somebody is. And if you think about it, right, these are all true. Right? How convinced someone will be of a halachic argument, often the first thing that people ask will be, who said it? Right? If you tell someone Moshe Feinstein said it, then that already, before you even get to the argument, gives it weight. That doesn't tell you automatically listen. But the person behind the position is important to how persuasive it is. The second issue, he says, is the state of mind you get them into. And this is also true. Right? If you say what is theoretically plausible, but you say it in a way that the person listening can't listen to it, it's not going to work. Right? And I'm going to show you an example in a minute. And the third is what we normally think of in Psak, which is the argument itself. Right? So you convince people in three ways: by who you are, by the state of mind you get them into as you're talking, and the content of the argument you make. And then he says, persuasion is achieved by the speaker's personal character when the speech is so spoken as to make us think him credible. We believe good men more fully and more readily than others. This is true generally, whatever the question is, and absolutely true where exact certainty is impossible and opinions are divided. I happen to think this is a very insightful piece by Aristotle. Because what does he say? If we put this in halachic language, when does the authority of the person talking become more important? When there's machloket, right? When there's different opinions, so it matters more who's talking. This kind of persuasion, like the others, should be achieved by what the speaker says, not what people think of his character before he begins to speak. Right now, he says, ideally, right, it should be the case that they should gain their opinion of you while you're talking. Now, this is not actually always true. It is not true, as some writers assume in their treatises on rhetoric, that the personal goodness revealed by the speaker contributes nothing to his power of persuasion. On the contrary, his character may almost be called the most effective means of persuasion he possesses. Secondly, right, and we know this is true, right, one of the most determinative factors of whether someone will be elected is where they rate on the likability scale. Right? We all know that. Right? If people like them, they tend to take their arguments more strongly. Then he says, secondly, persuasion may come through the hearers when the speech stirs their emotions. Our judgments when we are pleased and friendly are not the same as when we are pained and hostile. It is towards producing these effects as we maintain that present-day writers on rhetoric direct their whole of their efforts. This subject shall be treated in detail when we come to speak of the emotions. Thirdly, persuasion is effected through the speech itself when we have proved a truth or an apparent truth by means of the persuasive arguments suitable to the case in question. There are then these three means of effecting persuasion. The man is to be in command of them, must it be clear, be able to 1. Reason logically, 2, understand human character and goodness in their various forms. And 3, to understand the emotions, that is, to name them, describe them, to know their causes and the way in which they are excited. It thus appears that rhetoric is an offshoot of dialectic and also of ethical studies. Ethical studies may fairly be called political, and for this reason, rhetoric masquerades as political science, and the professors of it as political experts, sometimes from want of education, sometimes from attestation, etc. Next paragraph. Rhetoric has 3 distinct ends in view, one for each of its 3 kinds. The political orator aims at establishing the expediency or the harmfulness of the proposed course of action. If he urges its acceptance, he does so on the grounds that it will be good. If he urges its rejection, he does so on the grounds that it will do harm. And all other points, such as whether the proposal is just or unjust, honorable or dishonorable, he brings in as subsidiary and relative to this main consideration. Okay. So this is what I want you to think of, right? That writing psak isn't just about staking out a position, it's about convincing people. And therefore, as Aristotle said, there are 3 things you've got to do. One is convince the person you're talking to that you are a person worth listening to. 2 is get them into an emotional state where they're willing to hear your fundamental argument. And 3 is make the argument compellingly. Right? That is the goal of psak. Right? To convince people through those 3 ways. And the first one, which we won't focus on, but if you look at the Gemara is pretty clear about the fact that to be a halachic authority, right, the first criterion is, are you a good person? So if you look at the Gemara in Moed Katan, the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mai dechtiv ki siftei kohen yishmeru dat v'torah yivakshu mipiyu ki malach Hashem tzvakotu. What does it mean when it says, for the lips of the priest shall guard knowledge, and Torah teachings you shall seek from his mouth, for he is an angel of God. So the Gemara says, Im domeh harav lemalach Hashem yivakshu Torah mipiv. If your teacher is like an angel, so then seek Torah from him. The imlav al yivakshu Torah mipiv. And if not, don't. Right. So the Gemara already tells you. First things first, when you're looking for a guide, it has to be someone who's good. Okay? But now I want to focus on the other 2. Okay? I want to focus on the other 2 because I want to show you why I don't just want to focus on the content of your argument, but why I think it's so important to go through the process of formulating it and actually articulating it. So, this is, I think, a pretty extreme case, but I think it's very good at illustrating it. Okay, so this is from a fascinating pamphlet called Ma'amar Yirat Tahora, which is a Haredi pamphlet directed at the treatment of halachically dealing with people with OCD. Okay? Okay? Now, how much do you know about the unique complexities of OCD in the halacha community?
Not in the halacha community.
Okay, so
I know that OCD can oftentimes be very intense in
correct.
respect to religious practice.
Correct. And
there are so many laws
exactly
that already exist.
Exactly.
That then the OCD, especially like just like Haredi communities, which celebrate those types of qualities.
Exactly, 100%. Right there, it's so common that OCD, right? People with a tendency to OCD or whatever.
It's called scrupulosity.
Very good. Right? There's a special term for it called scrupulosity. Scrupulosity is OCD that manifests itself in religious practice, and it's very hard to detect. It's very hard. Why is it hard to detect? So this was illustrated beautifully in a book, Sanity and Sanctity. If you're interested in psychology, it's really an excellent book. It was what I had to read as part of my introduction to psychology course in college. It was written by 2 psychologists who worked in the Haredi community in Mea Shearim. And in their introduction, right, it's a case study to teach people how to deal with psychological issues, with necessitating the understanding of cultural context. So they give the following example. They say, let's say you have 2 people, okay? In the age of Corona, maybe this isn't as great of an example, but okay, ideally it is. Okay? you have one person who, every time they walk into their house, the first thing they do is they take off their shoes and disinfect them. They wipe down the door, and they wipe down the handle. They wash their hands precisely, an exact number of times. Right? They then go and they clean every doorknob in their house, right? Etc., etc. Okay? And they have this exact procedure, right? How they put on their shoes, how they take off their shoes, how they put on their clothes, take off their clothes to make sure that they avoid germs. Okay? Person 2, they wake up in the morning, and as soon as they wake up in the morning, they go and they make sure to get a cup which can contain at least 4 ounces of water, and they wash their hands. First their right, then their left, then their right, then their left, then their right, then their left. And then they use the bathroom and say a particular formula. Then they put on their shoes and they tie the right shoe. They put on the right shoe and then they put on their left shoe and then they tie their left shoe and then they tie the right shoe, right? Etc. Now they said at first glance both of these people sound equally
Crazy.
right, obsessive compulsive. But why do we? But one of them we recognize as someone who has certain obsessive nature, and the other one is someone who's keeping halacha. And we don't say they have obsessive compulsive nature. They said why? Because psychological issues have to be judged not by your standards, but by the standards of the world that the person's living in.
If it's not disrupting,
Exactly.
if it's not disrupting your daily flow
Exactly.
of life, it shouldn't be.
Right. And that's why, how do they judge scrupulosity, right? A classic case of scrupulosity is if somebody is convinced they never said Havdalah right, so they keep repeating the bracha over and over. Now, why is that a classic case of scrupulosity? Because Kavana isn't ma'akev by Havdalah. No one in the halacha community would say you do that. They'd say by saying Havdalah multiple times, you're violating a prohibition of bracha levatala. So you're not living within the norms of your self-stated community, right? And you're ruining your own life because you're sitting there for hours doing Havdalah. No one would tell you to do that. That's not what your world tells you, right? It is disrupting your life. But it doesn't change the reality that for people who have a tendency or already have OCD, its manifestation, halacha, makes it really bad. Okay? So what I wanted to do is focus on this paragraph from this halachic instructions to the person with suffering from OCD, which in Hebrew, they're just going to call it nervin. Okay, nerves. That's what they're going to call it. Okay? That's just what it's called here. This is 20, maybe in 21st century. It's pretty recent. This is not like so old. Okay?
What's the actual Hebrew term for OCD?
I don't know. Maybe it is nervin. I have no idea. I don't think it is, but I don't know. But in this Haredi book, it's called nervin. It could be that that's what's actually called. I have no idea. I want you to read this I want to read this paragraph, these 2 paragraphs with you, and I want you to focus not just on the argument. I want you to focus on rhetoric, because I want to convince you that psak, right, good psak, is not just about the argument you make, it's about how you make it. Okay? So let's read this together. Okay? Someone want to read it, or you want me to read it?
I can read it.
Okay, take it away.
The number 3?
Yeah.
ידענו מאוד הרבה מיני נרבים והמסתעף בשאר עניינים אשר אין מן הכבוד לאותם.
Okay.
What?
So what does that mean? So we know a lot of nervin, meaning we know a lot of psychological issues, right? And everything that comes from them, right? I'm mistaif b'shar inyanim, right? That branches out into other things. Right, so we can't detail them all here, right? Alkein yu beinechem ki lo hayiti fortam, right? So it's as if you did. Where did they get that language, by the way? It's poetic language, but where are they getting it from? Hatar Nidarim, if you remember from a few days ago,
Yeah.
right? I say to you, Dayanim Mumchim, right? I don't remember all the promises I made. So even though I should have said them, but I can't, so it should be ki'ilu ayiti fortam, as if I specified them. Okay? So let this, what I say now, let this be your guide for everything. Okay? Now to the actual argument. Take it away. Second paragraph, yeah?
עוד ידענו טבע
Hasibuchim.
It's just really hard to read.
Okay, so I'll read. It didn't come out great, but okay. Od yadanu teva hasibuchim b'mavos zeh. We know the nature of these complications in this, right? In this, right, mavo, this, right? Yeah, much more than that. In this, whatever, this complicated issue. She'akshanutam gdola. Their stubbornness is great. V'lo yeshitu lahem libam lahadvarim. They won't listen. They won't turn their hearts to the things. Ukitamid heim hayechidim shetzodkim. They know that they're the only ones who are right. Umivinim yoter min gedolei hador. They know more than the gedolim. Right? People have who have OCD, right? They're convinced they're doing it the exact right way. Or they think that they have more fear of God than anybody in the world. And therefore they have trouble relying on the poskim. Afra lipumayu. Right? That's right. Shove dirt in their mouths. Right? You can't say whatever. Okay. Aval minasayon yadua shekol elun yistabchu bioter. But we know from experience that all these types of people, it gets more and more complex. Until they're dying, they're drowning, right? Mayim ad nefesh, right? That water comes to their mouth. They feel like they're drowning in their obsession. Va'az bal korcham eskimu shedarkam al kala mut'ed bisoda va'az kasher shevatam lechaleit me'asvach. Right? It's only at that point where they can't survive that they seek help. Right? That's when people. When do people with OCD seek help? When they feel like they're beyond overwhelmed, they can't handle it. But by the point when they get to that point, it's too late. Right? It's really hard to get themselves out when they're that deep. Right? Right? The wise one has eyes in his head. He looks to the future. And we were already commanded by God. Listen to what the rabbis say. You have to listen to the rabbis even if right is left or left is right. And for sure they tell you to do the right thing. Right? You have to listen even if they tell you to do the wrong thing. For sure if rabbis tell you to do the right thing. This is literally a biblical obligation. 3 exclamation points. ועשית על פי הדבר שיגידו לך ונכלל בסמוך לחיזוק הדבר על פי התורה שירוחו ועל משפט אשר יאמרו לך תעשה. The Torah says you have to do what the rabbis say. ובכל המצווה גם כן לשמוע ולעשות בכל זמן וזמן כמצוות השופט. You have to listen to the rabbis every generation. כלומר החכם הגדול אשר יהיה בינינו בזמננו. To the rabbi, the posek in your time. ועובר על זה ונשומע לעצת הגדולים. The one who violates and doesn't listen to the gedolim שבדור of the generation בחוכמת התורה וכל אשר יראו מבטל עשה. Mevatel says that violates this positive command. V'odsho gadol shezeu amud hachazak shetor nishenet bo yadua hadavar l'kol mi sheyesh bo dat ad kan dvara. And this is what the Torah relies on. Now, what is the psak that this paragraph follows? So the psak that this paragraph follows is that if you have if you have this obsession, so you should make sure not to daven multiple times. And if you can't help yourself, then what should you do? Not daven. Not daven at all until you're cured. Because every time you daven, it feeds in. Okay? That's the psak that precedes this. Okay? With that as background, I want to think about the rhetoric here. I want to think about how this is functioning, not just as a psak, but what is it doing? What makes this effective? Right? To its audience. I want you to think about its audience. And because that's what I want you to think. I want you to realize how much of psak you have to think about audience. You have to think about style. Think about rhetoric. Why does this work, I think, for its audience?
It's kind of dramatic.
So first of all, it's dramatic. But it picks on certain very specific things. Yeah.
It's seems like the author definitely treats OCD seriously, but clearly talking to a crowd that doesn't necessarily.
Very good. So first, what it's doing very importantly is it's talking to people who are relatively likely to have people suffering from this in their midst, but are not necessarily willing to either take it seriously or talk about it. Right? So what does it do? How does it deal with that problem? Because it wants, right? It's very clear. This doesn't want to lay out a theoretical position. It wants to help people. So what does it do?
It phrases it in a way like the Mayimad Nefesh thing, like that it really could get so bad. And
Correct.
Like,
It
really
drives home the point, right? It uses, right? If you go back to Aristotle to point number 2, right? It gets you in the emotional state that you need to get in, right? You're not willing to accept my psak not to daven because you don't think this is serious, because right now you just see the person saying Shema really, really, really slowly and repeating some words in Shema, right? And that's all it looks like to you, right? It's getting them into the emotional state of mind, which is A, this is serious. B, you have no idea how bad it can get. It does something else. In general, right, it picks up on something. Why would someone suffering from scrupulosity, what arguments do people who are suffering from scrupulosity, what often drives them?
They think it's what they should be doing.
It thinks it's what they should be doing. And when you tell them it's not, what do they think? You're wrong. Why? Because I know better, I'm being from, right? That's the problem, is that scrupulosity, right, feeds into OCD, and it makes it very hard to tell the difference between Yirat Shamayim and obsession. What is, right, how do they want to treat OCD here, right? And in general, this is a good way of treating it. What does not work in treating obsession?
You can't continue doing the behavior.
So first of all, you can't continue doing the behavior. What else can't you do?
Feed into the mental state.
You can't feed into the mental state. And there's another thing you can't do. What is very not effective in trying to get out of the mental state?
Just telling people not to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Telling people not to do it, or explaining to them rationally why it doesn't work. That doesn't work, right? In general, what do we do? How do we stop people? Right? How do we help people get over obsession?
Help them catch the behavior.
Yeah, we tell them to stop the action, right? Don't, right? If your obsession is you need to wash your hands 200 times, right? Every time you touch a surface, right? Don't. Right here. Touch a surface, and now don't wash your hands. Or, in the age of Corona, only wash your hands once. Okay? Right? Train yourself to not do it. Right? The same way we deal with fears. Right? One of the classic ways that people deal with fear now is exposure therapy. Right? You're afraid of elevators, right? So, go in an elevator. Ride in an elevator. Just get used to it. In the Haredi community, there is a very effective rhetorical argument that they can use to get people to not think too much about it and just do it. And what is that?
Saying it to the right time.
Not just saying it to the right time.
Authority.
Yeah, authority. The rabbinic, right? The Haredi community is very susceptible to das Torah, right? So, if you are a Haredi person, if you're a Haredi posek, and you're writing something that's scrupulosity, and you know that the worst thing you could do is to try to rationally explain to the person why what they're doing is not good. So what do you need to do? Right? What weapon do you have in your arsenal that maybe someone doesn't in a different community doesn't? But in your community, you have a very effective weapon, and that is just tell them they have to do it because they have to do it. Because Das Torah is such a central belief in the Haredi community that it has cultural resonance to say to them, look, you think what I'm telling you to do is not good? You think you're frummer than the Gedolim? Right? That's what he says. Right? Afra lepumayu. You saw how he did that? Right? He said, they think they have more Yirat Shamayim than the Gedolim. And that's why they're going to keep doing Afra lepumayu. Right? Stuff dirt in their mouth. You can't say you're greater than Gedolim. The Gedolim told you to do it? Do it. You have to listen to Gedolim even if they're wrong, for sure when they're right. Right? Now, we may not be part of the Haredi community, and Das Torah may not have the same resonance in our community. But I want you to understand this document as not just a halachic argument, but in attempt, right? What is the document trying to do? It's trying to actually help people in the Haredi community who are suffering from scrupulosity. So, what do you have to do? You have to use whatever weapons you have in your arsenal. And if the best thing is to just get them to act in a certain way and not think too much about it, because once you start thinking about it, that feeds into the neurosis. So, it's very effective for someone who Das Torah already has cultural resonance to invoke it. So when I read this, this piece, and I think about it, not right. If I read this piece and just thought of it, will this convince me? Right. So I might say, well, I don't know. Right. Give me the arguments. They'll just throw Das Torah in my face. Right. But when I think about this as talking to a Haredi person who's suffering from scrupulosity, and what's feeding to the scrupulosity is that they keep overthinking things and therefore doing harmful activities. And in the Haredi community, they may not listen to a psychologist, right? So you can't just tell them go to a psychologist who will tell you how to deal with it behaviorally, right? But they might listen to psychological advice if it's couched in rabbinic terminology. So basically, what are they saying, right? Any psychologist might say this, right? If you feed into it, so don't do that activity. But they might not listen to the psychologist because he has no Yireh Shamayim, she has no Yireh Shamayim. But if a rabbi comes and couches it in, no, this is Das Torah, it's a mitzvah d'oraisa, you have to listen to the Chachamim, to the Gedolim, right? Just do it, it'll help you. It's actually a very effective, not just argument, it's a very effective way, I think, of at least trying to persuade people in that community. But I think it's a good text to look at because it's not necessarily one written for our community. It's not necessarily one that speaks to us. But I think we can all, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think we can all appreciate how, to a particular audience, for a particular type of problem, this is actually a very cleverly, sensitively, right? It might be a little bit harsh, but it's actually an emotionally sophisticated way of not just articulating an argument, but getting it across in a way that might help the person that they're trying to help. And that's why when I say that, right, this art of writing a psak, right, that I don't want you just, again, this may be towards the end of the semester, right, that you are thinking about this, but the whole time that we're learning this, I want you not just to think in terms of halachic arguments, I want you to think of how you would write it, how would you articulate it, what are you trying to do, and who are you trying to convince? Let me give you a few more examples, okay? Next one is from the Ramah. Right, the Ramah is the most prominent of the Ashkenazi poskim, right? Obviously, writes his comments on Shulchan Aruch. He tells you something very interesting in his Toras Chatas. He has a separate Sefer Toras Chatas, and he writes as follows. He writes that sometimes in the Ramah, he'll write that something is prohibited unless it's going to cause loss or it's Erev Shabbos, and you need to rely on a leniency. Okay? Now, what is the rational basis for that? A halachic basis for that? He doesn't tell you in the Ramah. In Toras Chatas, he tells you, and he says, "Hinei et natzel b'davar echad shelo yachshidena ma'ayin." Let me apologize for something so you don't suspect me of wrongdoing. V'hu, and that is, ki lefamim kadavti lahakel be'esid meruba. Sometimes I say you should be lenient when there's loss. Ola ani b'davar chashuv, or to a poor person. Ola kavod Shabbat, or for the honor of Shabbat. Why did I write all these things? V'hu mitam ki ba'otana mekomot hayanira li keter gamur. Because in those cases, I actually thought it was totally permitted. Aliba de hilchata, according to the strict letter of the law. But the later authorities were stringent. And therefore, really I think it's always permitted. But out of deference to the later poskim, when possible, I think you should be stringent. But when there's counter pressure, I think you should be lenient. So then, if that's the case, why didn't I just say that? Right? If what I meant was it's really permitted, but you should be stringent, if it's not too hard to be stringent, then why did I couch it in this terminology of it's permitted as long as for Kavod Shabbos? Why would I say that? He says, "V'kadam mariment b'tshuvoto siman tedvav ani kol yimad v'ashir b'ravei shabbatot shavin hein." Marimin said, poor people, their status, the leniencies you're willing to apply for them all year, and a rich person on Erev Shabbat, they're equivalent. Umikol makom haminhag lomer lahem hatam zeh mibnei anyo zeh mibnei kavod Shabbat kidei shel yitmehu shel v'hem ha'otzer l'famim matir. The custom is to tell them that the reason you're being lenient is because they're poor or because of kavod Shabbat, so they won't be shocked that sometimes you're lenient and sometimes you're stringent. Now, what is the Ramah doing? What is the Ramah telling you? And I'm not telling you have to like what the Ramah is doing, but what is the Ramah telling you?
That you shouldn't always be either lenient or stringent.
You shouldn't always?
You shouldn't always be either lenient or stringent. You need a variance.
That's for sure, but more than that, what is he telling you rhetorically?
Sometimes he just says that, oh, it's for Shabbat, or like, because you're bored. But, like,
Yeah, but so what's implied here?
Yeah.
Good. What's implied here is that this book, Tar Chatos, who's he writing to?
The educated.
The educated. And the Ramah, who's he writing to?
The
Everybody. And therefore he tells you, look, the formal argument of what I'm saying is, this is permitted. All things being equal, you should be stringent to follow the stringent positions, but really it's permitted, and whenever there's a counter pressure, I'll let you rely on the letter of the law. But the average uneducated person can't handle that. And therefore I've come up with catchphrases that have no real halachic meaning, but they're enough to not confuse people, right? And give them the heter that they really deserve without confusing them, right? What's the Ramah telling you? He's telling you that, look, Psak isn't just about the argument, because the argument he gives to the poskim, he said, but Pasking for people is, right, you have to say it in a way they're going to listen. And they're not going to lose faith in the halachic system. I probably told you this story last year at some point. Ari Lam once told me that he was once with his grandfather, and his grandfather got a shayla. A woman came over to him and said, I don't know the exact shayla, something like her, dairy spoon fell in her fleshik sink. Right? What does she do? So Ari Lam said, whatever he said, you should take it and you should, stick it in the dirt and rinse it off and whatever. Let it sit for a day or something like that. I don't know what he said exactly. So Ari turned to his grandfather and he said, I guess now they're both Rabbi Doctor. Rabbi Doctor Ari turned to his grandfather, Rabbi Dr. Norman, okay? Like, whatever. And he said, what are you talking about? What's the halacha if your dairy spoon falls into your fleshik sink?
Yeah.
Nothing, right? Rinse it off, done. So Rabbi Lam said, yeah, you're right, but I've known this woman for 50 years. And I'm telling you, if I tell her it's permitted, you know what she's going to do? She's not going to believe me, and she's going to throw out the spoon. She's not going to believe me. I'm telling you. If I tell her to do something, she doesn't know halacha. She doesn't know. But she feels like she needs to do something. If I give her anything to do, right, which she views as koshering, she'll do it and she'll keep her spoon. If I tell her the actual halacha, she just won't listen and she'll throw it out. So I had to tell her something because I don't want her to throw out her spoon. Right? I know her. So, is that the right halachic answer? No, it's not the right halachic answer. But if your goal is not just to give the halachic answer, but to get the right halachic result, that might be a proper way to do it. And that's what I'm saying. He's saying, look, this is not the right halachic argument. But the average uneducated person, at least in his time, you couldn't tell them, because they would be shocked. They'd say, but if it's permitted, should we always be permitted? Why am I normally stringent? Right? And if we should be stringent, why are you being lenient here? So if you come up with something that sounds formalistic, right? So they'll say, oh, Kavod Shabbos, I get that. That's a special heter. Right? They don't need to know what's behind it. But the Ramah is telling you, in no uncertain terms, right, that the rationale doesn't always have to be the one that you give. And that's why, I'm saying you might choose, like the Ramah does, to write two versions. Right? I tend to think this doesn't work as well in a world of instant communication, because you can't really hide arguments, but, and you can't do that as much, I think. Okay, let me give you one more example, because I think this is a very potent one, and then I want to talk for a few minutes about what topic we might do, okay? let's skip to the Tzitz Eliezer. Okay? This is really one of my classic examples of this. So, this is a tshuva by the Tzitz Eliezer on aborting a child with Tay-Sachs. Okay? So, painful shayla? Painful question, 100%. The Tzitz Eliezer has a very long tshuva, not the one I gave you here, on the question of abortion. The Tzitz Eliezer, in general, thinks that the Rambam is of the position that a fetus is a living being, and therefore abortion is sort of like murder. It's just that under certain circumstances it's permitted. Okay? The Ramban believes that a fetus is not a living being, it's potential life, and that's why in certain circumstances you can terminate the pregnancy. The reason we don't do that flippantly is because potential life still has value. Okay? That's big adult. The Tzitz Eliezer is of the position that the majority view is that abortion is not murder, and that fetuses in halacha are not alive. And therefore, the Tzitz Eliezer is very lenient in general about abortion for a variety of reasons. Right? Obviously, not lenient, just do it, but he's pretty lenient for a lot of reasons. Okay, meaning even in some quite striking and I think problematic ways. Even if you're of his position that you think it's more lenient, meaning he legitimates aborting a fetus with Downs, right? Meaning he's really quite lenient. In his lengthy tshuva, he goes through both.
Might be more about how he views Down syndrome than how he views
Yes.
abortion.
Well, I'm saying that's right. That's why that tshuva is a bit problematic. Yes, 100%. But here's one about Tay-Sachs. Okay? Now, this tshuva is written to Dr. Steinberg, who's writing on behalf of parents. And Dr. Steinberg, I assume you've come across at some point, the Encyclopedia of Jewish Medical Ethics. That's Dr. Steinberg, right? He is both a posek. He's written that. He writes the Encyclopedia, the Mikropedia Talmudit. He's also the head of, or was the head of, I think it's pediatric oncology or pediatric neuro-oncology or something at Shaarei Tzedek. He's a very impressive person. He writes the entries to the Mikropedia Talmudit between patients. He's a very, very impressive person. So he asked on behalf of these parents, and he says as follows. Hafsakat ha'erion b'gala machala nikrei Tay-Sachs. Kasher mavchenim et ha'machala be'ubar ka'avor shlosha chadashim ha'erion. What do? 3 months into the pregnancy, you determine the child has Tay-Sachs. Hasheilahi.
Is that the normal time that Tay-Sachs is detected?
Now we can do it a little bit earlier, but the earliest we can do it now is a little over 6 weeks, about 45 days, I think.
Okay.
Which is, since even the more machmir positions like Ramosha Feinstein think you can abort before 40 days, 45 days isn't great, right? If we got it a few days earlier, that would be great according to everybody. Great, whatever, be better. But we're not quite there.
Okay.
But 3 months is already, right, second trimester, right, beginning of second trimester, end of first trimester. Hasheilahi, odot hafsakat ha'erion b'gala machala Tay-Sachs. Right, your question about abortion because of Tay-Sachs, asher b'chanta b'taglit od b'shlavei ha'erion, which was revealed in later stages of the pregnancy. Hamachala itor shatit, simanem muvhakim, hemipatchut l'kuyah shel hayeled, right, it's genetic, it has very specific symptoms, manifestations, right, the child doesn't develop. Toch shnat chayav harishona, yeled naaseh b'shana ze yoter yod mefager b'tvarachto ha'fizik v'zichlik yachad. In the first year, the child deteriorates physically and mentally. Mu'avatech ivaron v'shituk kofani, becomes blind and paralyzed. Hatotzai kayom b'li yosei min haklal mavet ad gil arba, and it is certain death by the age of 4. Ein kayom tipul specific l'machalazo. There is no treatment. Prat l'siud liyadim v'zrab psychologi v'acheret l'orim, except basically supporting the child and psychological help for the parents. Ein sikui l'atzil yelad. You can't save the child. Maybe you can lengthen the life a few months. When he was doing this, reality is you can only test by 3 months. So your life is you're putting your life in your question, your soul in this question. With something so severe and so certain. Is it bad enough to allow for an abortion even after the first trimester? Or is the first trimester your absolute limit? Or is the only reason to abort after 3 months, after first trimester, if the mother's life is in danger? So he writes, after looking with seriousness at all angles of this question, as it seems, based on that lengthy thing I wrote over there, that this severe case, that even up to 7 months you could abort in this case. As long as you don't endanger the mother. After 7 months, he thinks it's more chamor. Because after 7 months, the child can be born. Right? Meaning we know that, right? Meaning my twins were born at 34 weeks, right? They can.
By the way.
Thank you. But 34 weeks, right? They're healthy, right? They're small, but they're healthy, right? Lungs are developed, right? 30, and if they had to, they would have even induced them a week earlier, right? By 33, they're pretty healthy, right? They can survive.
So, what about when science keeps developing and developing that we can keep the child alive for longer?
Correct. That might be different, right? It might be different, but in his time, he's talking about 7 months. Okay. It's clear to me that Jews are not killed for abortion. Except for one position that's least prohibited. But a lot of people think it's only rabbinic. Or just to build the world up. But there is no murder at all. And therefore the Marid says that it's mutter, okay? And then next paragraph. So pay attention if there's a need. Is there any tsar v'kav? Is there anything as painful as this? Yoter gadol mizeh shel anenu? Is there anything as painful as this situation? Asher yigrom la'em ba'avlad la'yitzur kazeh, that I'll have the child like this? Shekulo omer yisurim achovim itado batuach l'meshach mishrat shem. Its suffering is certain, and its death in a few years is certain. Ve'eineo rimraot v'chalot. The parents are looking at you; their eyes are dimming. Be'ein la'el yadam lo shiach, because they have no way of helping their child. Ubarur shlo mishanem lo mechit klum b'mayalad azikach u'mosan miuchad lo yinu gichal l'rim admatay. It won't help them if they take the child away. That's not going to take away their pain. And forget, plus the suffering of the child itself. If there was ever a time to permit, because of pain and suffering, this is the classic case. I don't care what you're talking about. Mental anguish, physical pain, everything is here. The psychological anguish is more painful than the physical ones. It puts a weight of iron on your shoulder. And sometimes the psychological anguish leads to physical results, right? A heart attack, right? And the like, right? And the parents, etc. Umi, and who better than you, Dr. Steinberg, who works in pediatric oncology? Who knows better how painful this could be? So in this case, with all the pain, psychological, emotional, spiritual, Pa'alim. There's no way of getting around this pain, etc. Skipping down. So therefore it should be permitted. And then the last paragraph he says, Umasher iti, and that which I saw they bring from the Meshech Chachma, that it's murder, and that you have Misa B'dei Shamayim, that's a sheet that we don't hold of. Okay? So in the time we have left, I want to just talk about this. I find this tshuva to be very effective at what it wants to do. But let's talk about what it wants to do. What does it want to do? What does he want to do in this tshuva?
Forcefully convince people.
Yeah, I think it's more than forcefully convince. What does he want to do?
Guilt the audience for allowing it. For like not letting people work.
He wants to?
He wants to guilt the audience.
I mean, he wants to convince them it's the right thing to do. And what does he not want, right? He wants to make sure they do it. And what does he not want?
Them to think that there's like a doubt that maybe like they should.
Yeah, because if you get into his head, he thinks the right thing to do is to abort it because of the agony to the child and the parents. But think about it from the parents' perspective. I want you to imagine, in this tshuva, if the Tzitz Eliezer wrote the same tshuva that he did before. Okay? Which goes like this. There are many opinions about this. The majority of the Rishonim think that it's not murder and to be permitted. There is one position that it is murder of your child, and that happens to be the Rambam. We don't paskin like that, but it is the Rambam. For the average person who's not educated and doesn't necessarily know the name of every Rishon, how are they going to feel if you tell them you're allowed to do it, but just know the Rambam thinks you're murdering your child? How likely is it that they're going to be okay now with what they're about to do?
Not at all.
Yeah, I think not at all. So what does he do? It's actually a very brilliant tshuva, right? Or a very sensitive tshuva. What does he do? He says,
He doesn't
first,
present any opposition.
correct. First what he does is he says, first he starts with the facts. He says, why does he start with facts? This is classic communication. You want someone to think that they understand you. What do? That you understand them, rather. What do?
You tell a story.
Yeah, and you repeat the facts back to them. You say, I know what you're going through, right? He repeats it. I know. This is terrible. The child's going to die within a few years. There's nothing you can do. It's going to be terrible for the parents, for the child. First things first, you want the people to listen to you, show them you understand them. Right? You need to do that in this tshuva. And then, what does he do? He wants to tell them it's definitely fine. But he wants to be honest. So how does he manage to be completely intellectually honest, but not tell them it's permitted, but the Rambam thinks you're murdering your child? How does he do it?
It's like written elsewhere. And
Yes! It's a very effective thing. What does he say?
I explored this.
I explored this elsewhere, and the lengthy background, if you're interested, is somewhere else. Right? It's totally honest. Right? And as I've established there, I think it's permitted. So what does he do? He hides them. He doesn't lie. He just tells them what they need to hear. What do they need to hear? What he thinks is true, which is, it's permitted. And how does he... But he doesn't want to pretend that it's not a machloket, because then what's going to happen? The parents will one day hear it's a machloket, and they'll be like, you mean somebody thinks that we murdered our child? So what does he do?
He says, like, I've worked through the issue.
So he does that, but then in the last paragraph he does something else. What does he do? He says, there are people, he quotes, some people based on the Meshech Chachma say it's murder. Right? Now, what is he really doing? I think.
he's like softening the blow a bit.
Yeah, because what is he saying? He's saying, for the average person, if you tell them, yeah, there's some 20th century posek that you may or may not have heard of who takes the position that it's murder. So now, later on, when the parents hear, oh, it's a machloket, they'll be like, yeah, we know that it's a machloket, but right, Waldenberg told us that the majority of it is the right thing to do. He gets it into there's another position, but he actively doesn't go back to the Rishonim, because I think for the average person, if you told them the Rambam thinks you're murdering your child, they'd be like, wait, right, I don't care who else said it, but that name is going to stick in your head. But if he says, oh, there's a 20th century posek who says that it's murder and maybe it wouldn't be permitted, okay, so they're allowed to know it's a machlokes. But right, Waldenberg is telling them, I understand you, and I think the majority of you, and the right thing to do is to abort the child to deal with the pain. He doesn't give them all the details. He doesn't give them all the arguments. He hides them from the detail that the Rambam thinks that this is murder of their child, because he doesn't paskin like the Rambam. Now, obviously, I'm not telling you not to paskin like the Rambam, but I'm saying that the Tzitz Eliezer, who thinks you shouldn't paskin like the Rambam, comes up with an intellectually honest way of presenting the argument, totally honestly, but without doing what no parent in that situation wants to hear, which is, right, no parent in that situation wants to say, look, there's a list of all these people who think you're murdering your child, and among them is the Rambam, and there's these people who think that it's okay, and I think it's okay. They don't want to hear that. If they're turning to you and you think it's okay, they need you not just to paskin, they need you to comfort them. Right? They need you to give them the confidence to do something that's going to tear them up no matter what you say. So you need to do your best. So what I think these examples show is that, right, when I say that for the next few months I want to, run a tshuva writing seminar, I want you to start thinking about psak, not just about making a log argument. Obviously that's a good percentage of it, and what we're going to focus on, right? But I also want you in the back of your mind to think about the fact that when it gets down to writing, the reason I want you to put it on paper, right, and present it to your peers and defend it, is because I want you to realize what it means. It's not just to be accountable for halachic arguments. I want you to understand what it means to be accountable to people and to present it in a way that people will listen, right? Because psak is about more than lumdus, right? It's not just the theoretical, the chakiras, the conceptualization of the sugya. It's about taking ownership over that decision and how it's going to affect actual people's lives, right? That's what psak is, okay? So, in the time we have, what type of topic do you want to do? I have a few ideas in my head, but before I bias you, what type of topic do you want to cover for the